This is the second lecture for the organizational communication module. Tonight I want to talk to you about the channels of communication in an organization. I think it's especially relevant given the fact that so much in an organization has changed so rapidly right now in terms of how organizations are communicating with each other via online virtual meetings and collaboration software, all the stuff that you guys are going to be learning in the digital class. So I think it's entirely appropriate. I want to start with a couple of thoughts. I had you read 3 different research articles, and all 3 of those articles really came about as a result of research that was being done by people, probably most likely PhDs getting their doctorates. And what happens often is they have to find some very unique small piece of a theory to test out in order to kind of make themselves stand out and get published. But also the delay between the study and when it gets published means that even though the studies I found you were from 2019, 2020, they were still almost outdated already in the research that they did, because the research had probably been done at least 3 years earlier. So I think that in getting used to looking at research studies, one of the richest parts of the studies is the literature reviews, because graduate students have to go back and kind of summarize what's already been done in order to make a case for why they should study the question that they're going to study. The other thing is that this field of communications has always had this kind of political nature between human communication and technological communication. And there's sort of an inherent bias in a lot of research that the best form of communication between people is going to be face-to-face. Understandably so, because that's what we have done for so long and so many years in organizations. But I think that we are heading into a world in which we have to kind of adjust what we think we mean by face-to-face. So last week we talked about the structures of organizations, the formal communication that goes on in an organization, and how it can reflect the various types of organizations that we have. Now we're going to look at specific channels of organizations, of communication. But before I do that, I want to move to this theory, media richness theory, in order to talk about the channels and how they've changed. So let's talk about what we mean by the actual channels. So if we're going to talk about face-to-face, in an organization, there's a whole range of ways people meet, from formal meetings, forums, celebrations, informal meetings, right? But also we are moving into a huge world of online face-to-face that we have to expand. We also still have print communication, right? We start with letters and forms, and then we move to newsletters and brochures. But emails, especially today, are taking on a new kind of form of print communication. So I'm going to look at that research where she talks about the emails and kind of expand it and apply it. And then audiovisual communication, which of course any audio could be starting from the telephone, any video starting from literally videos that people put together, presentations they put together. But of course nowadays with our online meetings and our online collaboration software, those are also what we want to call audiovisual channels of communication. So this media richness theory that I have you read, it started in 1986, and in its original form, it really has a lot of sort of biases in it. In the change in the technological environment that we have, and the change in the type of employees we have with younger people coming into organizations, I think that there's been a change in how different channels are being used. So when you look at the media richness theory, I kind of think about it like as if somebody had created a theory in the early years of the motor car, when people were still lamenting the loss of the horse-drawn carriage, for example. And while there was this change, and this obvious change, right, there was this tendency to want to say, yes, but the horse-drawn carriage was better because it was slower, we had more time to talk, Right. So there is this dynamic in the original media, in the media richness theory, that shows the face-to-face channel as the richest channel. And we can talk more about that when we meet on Wednesday night. All right. To start with, I want to show you this cute video these two students did. It's just so good, and I thought, I'm not going to repeat it. They're very articulate, and it's going to kind of give you an overview of this media richness theory. And then we'll come back and I'll recap a little more of my thinking on it.
Welcome to our micro lecture on media richness theory. In this video, we will explain the media richness theory in the context of social media. We will first explain the two main concepts of the theory, talk about media richness and its different levels, and then go into the criticism on the theory and its possible successor. Afterwards, we will make the connection to social media. And lastly, we will provide you with a suggestion for further research on media richness theory in the context of social media. Meet Richard Duft and Robert Lengel. One day in 1986, they were wondering, why do organizations process information? As ambitious academics, they first looked into literature. Based on the social information processing theory, they found that equivocality and uncertainty are of importance when you process information. Equivocality is also referred to as ambiguity. An ambiguous situation is when conflicting and multiple interpretations exist. You have probably seen this ambiguous picture before, in which you can see both a duck and a rabbit. Uncertainty occurs in a situation during which there is a lack of information. Thus, you need more information before you can answer a certain question. So, the answer to the question, why do organizations process information, is that both ambiguity and uncertainty need to be reduced. Duft and Lengel were now asking themselves, how can you reduce ambiguity and uncertainty? This is where the concept of media richness comes into place. The two academics found that some media works better than other media for certain tasks. This depends on their level of richness. Back in the days, when people still used phones to call each other, email was a novelty, and fax machines were still used, Duft and Lengel proposed this ranking of media based on their level of richness. The level of richness is determined by 4 factors. These are multiple signals, immediate feedback, personalization, and conversational language. First, the ability of the medium to transmit multiple signals. There are a number of ways in which information can be communicated. Think of text such as spoken or written words, verbal cues such as voice, or non-verbal cues, for example, gestures. The second factor is the possibility of immediate feedback within the medium. This means the extent to which a medium enables users to give rapid feedback. The third factor is personalization. Personalization stands for the possibility to alter a message specifically to intended recipients or a situation. The ease of using conversational language in the medium, such as slang, is the last factor determining the level of richness. When looking back on the ranking, you can see face-to-face communication is regarded as the richest medium and a written report is the poorest medium. But then how does media richness connect to uncertainty and ambiguity reduction? Duft and Lengel found that when you perform a task which is considered high in ambiguity and uncertainty, a rich medium is needed. This will lead to an increase of the performance. This well-known scene from the series Sex and the City shows why the medium task fit is important.
So, Carrie, what was your news? Oh, Berger broke up with me on a Post-it.
On a Post-it?
Yep. Read it and weep, my friends.
I'm sorry, I can't. Don't hate me. The motherfucker's concise.
After the introduction, the media richness theory received critical reviews from other scholars. These academics found that other factors had to be taken into account when choosing a medium for a task, such as personal preferences and perception. Thus, the initial theory was criticized on its rationality. Especially when the new media came into existence, the criticism regarding the theory grew. Dennis and Kinney mention in their paper, the traditional idea of matching media richness to equivocality is unlikely to improve performance when using the new media. We believe that the limiting factor in the successful use of so-called lean media may not be the media itself, but merely our preconceived perceptions of their limitations. A potential successor for the media richness theory is the media synchronicity theory. Synchronicity refers to the extent in which a medium provides its users to work together on the same activity with the same information at the same time. Two essential information processes according to this theory are conveyance and convergence, whereas conveyance is the transmission of information from different sources and convergence the comparison of this information. The theory states that the effective use of media is to match media capabilities to these fundamental communication processes required to perform the task. The media capabilities consist of symbol variety, parallelism, feedback, rehearsability and reprocessability. We suggest you read further into this article. Despite the negative criticism of the theory, scholars still apply it in their studies. However, they only refer to the ranking of richness and neglect the ambiguity and uncertainty part of the theory. When looking into one of the most recent forms of media, social media, there seems to be no research that combines media richness theory and social media yet. You now know the theory of media richness, which consists of two concepts, ambiguity and uncertainty, and we also explained how the reduction of these are of importance when you process information. You also know now that media can be ranked based on their level of richness and how you can use this ranking to decide which medium is best to use in what situation to reduce ambiguity and uncertainty. When it comes to social media, there is a lack of studies in
Okay, she's going to talk just a little bit about social media, but I want to get back out here. I just think she does a very good job sort of helping us understand this theory, but I want to go over it a little bit more with you again now. So, these two concepts, uncertainty, which is caused by not having enough information to make a decision, answer a question. It could also be caused by too much information, and I want to make sure that, again, this is something that they left out, because the key is you want to give just the right amount of information so everybody is, in effect, on the same page. And then ambiguity. Ambiguity is the lack of clarity. She showed you when you look at a picture and it can be either the rabbit or the duck, right? So the lack of clarity of what the person is saying, not necessarily because there's not enough information, but either the channel that the information is being sent through or the person themselves, the words they're using, how they're talking about it, makes it kind of foggy, if you will. So clarity being the understanding of the meaning, and uncertainty being the ability to make decisions and process it and answer questions, if you will. So quantity and quality might be another way to think about this. And then equivocality, and she was a little bit off on this. Equivocality, right, is the confusion that occurs as a result of those two things, uncertainty and ambiguity. So what we want to do is reduce equivocality, right? And that means we have a richness in our communication. So initially the theory looked at the channel's ability to reduce that equivocality. And as she said, there was a huge bias towards face-to-face. There were four things that they looked at in the original theory. The feedback that you could get, and of course they had a bias on immediate feedback, that somehow if I have a question and you can answer it right away, that reduces my uncertainty. If I can ask you to clarify what you're saying, that will reduce the ambiguity. But sometimes the feedback being delayed and having time to process is what helps reduce the equivocality. Multiple cues to aiding understanding. Again, verbal, nonverbal cues, videos. There's also an assumption that when you're sitting in a meeting, right, you can give more cues, but you can also get very tired of hearing the same person talking over and over and over again, right? So again, the channels that are used, right, to aid the understanding, the multiple cues may not always be what you think they should be. And then the language, right? The ability to adapt and change. And she says something very interesting. She talks about use of slang, for example. But I think language is also the ability to make sure your language is precise and conveys what it is you really intend. And sometimes I think when you're talking, like I'm doing in a lecture, there's a danger that you're picking the wrong words. And when you're writing something out, there's more clarity. And then finally, the personal focus of the communication. If the channel allows you to adapt to the individual that you're talking to, that also will improve the richness. So this was sort of the original theory. And again, here's another, just like she showed, here's another one of these funny little charts, but you can see on the left-hand side, the richness of the media going up, right, on the types of channels. And for SMS would be text, mail, hanging out, meeting with subgroups, right? But also on the right, going the complexity of the act of communication, what you're asking people to do. So you're telling them we have to meet at a bar, directions on how to find the bar, the actual planning of the project or the interview, right? And they're talking about, for trivial tasks, media richness can be inappropriate. But what's fascinating about this is that they're making an assumption about which tasks are rich, if that makes sense. So it's not just the channel, right? Excuse me, which tasks are trivial. I said that wrong, see? That which channel is appropriate for which task, who's making the assumption that the task is trivial. So that's another thing I want to talk to you about when we meet on our Zoom. So there was this expansion of media richness theory, and she mentions this, one being that we look at the channel's ability to support or share this coordinated behavior, right? So the ability for the channel to exchange information fairly rapidly, to communicate with more than one person at the same time, to code the message in multiple ways, right? And then they had two new additional factors that I think are good. The ability of the channel to allow you to fine-tune the message, and the ability of the channel to allow the receiver to examine the message and provide feedback back, right? Reprocess the information. So what you're envisioning is the channel's ability to keep this communication flow happening. And the assumption, again, is that the face-to-face is best. So, for example, if I'm lecturing to you, certainly I pick up cues from you that you're getting what I'm saying or you're not if we're face-to-face. But also if I'm face-to-face, just like right now when I'm recording, right, there's a chance that I'm going to misstate something like I just did with talking about trivial tasks versus media richness. And so sometimes when the channel is, say, written, as in the articles that you're reading, there's actually more clarity because the person who has written it has had the chance to rehearse, to fine-tune the message, and you have the chance to go back over the message. So there's a lot to this media synchronicity that helps us look at what channels are richest for us for which tasks. There's another theory, media multiplexity, which is media's ability to foster relationships. And that is sort of the way a media channel can strengthen a relationship and the number of media used to create the relationship. So here we are coming into the more technologically supported ideas of media richness that says, look, we need to understand that various channels are going to help with media richness. And that's where some of that collaboration software that you guys are going to work with is going to be coming into play because it is going to increase this media multiplexity. So here's media synchronicity, and I just put this up not because we go through the 5 factors again, but just that you see media synchronicity looking at the communication as a process, right? So the channel, right, the ability of the sender to rehearse, the ability of the receiver to reprocess, the ability of it to be able to reach more than one person and provide the feedback allows us to look at and question which channels are richest. So here's the considerations I want to think about for this media richness theory. First of all, there's an assumption in the original theory that media richness is inherent in the channel itself, versus our use of it. And I think this is where they were going with media synchronicity. And it's where the other research that I'm having you read, and we're going to talk about in the second part of this lecture, goes that how we use the medium also makes it richer or leaner. So here's a couple of ideas. What type of information it is that we have, right, that we're conveying with this channel, and the kind of symbols we're using. So the words, the pictures, the language, right? All of that, we're choosing that. The channel itself doesn't necessarily limit that. We limit it ourselves. The type of tasks, right? They talked about tasks being trivial. Well, organizations, what about positive and negative interactions, right? If you have to reprimand somebody, is the face-to-face channel the best? Is it better to put it in writing so the person can read it and not have an emotional first reaction? Hiring. There's a lot of discussion about hiring now that we have to hire virtually versus seeing someone in person. And both of these things I think are interesting to talk about in the new virtual reality that we're facing. What's the organization's culture with the channels? Because in the second half I'm going to talk about sort of our attitudes, our preference, our experience with channels also affect how rich that channel is in improving the communication. And finally, the number of people communicating, right? If it's 2 people, if it's 8 people, if it's 100 people, right? What channel are you using, and how is that channel going to make the communication rich? Okay, so there's a lot there for you to think about. I'm going to take a break, and then when you have had a break, had a moment to kind of absorb that, we're going to go into the second part of the lecture to discuss the next 2 pieces of research.